On a warm January afternoon in 1919, a tank the size of a small building let go all at once, and 2.3 million gallons of molasses exploded into the streets of Boston. The wave that followed moved faster than most cars drive through a city today. By the time it stopped, 21 people were dead. This is the Great Molasses Flood of Boston. The full story. Chapter 1. A tank built in a hurry. In 1915, the United States was still 2 years from entering the First World War, but demand for industrial alcohol was already soaring. Munitions makers needed it for explosives, distillers needed it for rum, and the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, decided Boston's North End was the place to cash Indiana. On a stretch of waterfront at 529 Commercial Street, the company raised an enormous steel tank, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, built to hold up to 2.3 million gallons of raw molasses shipped in from the Caribbean and fermented into industrial alcohol. The man in charge of building it was Arthur Gell, the company's treasurer, not an engineer, not an architect, just an executive under pressure to get the tank finished and filling. Gell skipped the standard practice of testing a new tank by filling it with water first, a slow but crucial way to catch leaks and weak seams before anything dangerous went in. Decades later, engineers who examined the surviving steel found it was roughly half as thick as it should have been, and missing enough manganese to make it dangerously brittle. In 1915, nobody in Boston knew any of that. They just knew the tank was enormous, and it was already full. The location made the risk worse than it needed to be. The North End was one of Boston's most densely packed neighborhoods, home to thousands of Italian immigrant families living in tight rows of tenements, with a firehouse, a rail yard, and a busy freight terminal all crowded within a few blocks of the waterfront. A tank of that size would have been a hazard almost anywhere. Wedged into a working-class neighborhood where children played in the streets and laborers passed beneath it every day, it was standing directly over the lives it would eventually take. Chapter 2. The warnings no one heeded. From its very first fill in 1915, the tank leaked. Local children treated the seeping molasses like a free treat, showing up with pails and cups to scoop it straight from the seams at the tank's base. Rather than fix the leaks, the company's solution was cosmetic. It painted the entire tank brown, so the streaks running down its sides would blend in and stop drawing complaints. Neighbors who lived closest to the tank came to know another warning sign, too, a deep, groaning rumble that rolled through the steel every time the tank was filled near capacity, as though the metal itself were straining to hold its shape. At least one employee of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company raised the alarm directly with his bosses, warning that the tank was unsafe. The company's response was to have it recaulked and repainted, treating a structural problem as a cosmetic one, and otherwise carried on as usual. By January of 1919, the tank had been filled to near capacity 8 separate times since it was built, each fill adding another cycle of stress to steel that had never been properly tested in the first place. Nobody ordered an inspection. Nobody drained the tank. The molasses kept arriving by ship, and the tank kept holding it, until the moment it didn't. None of this happened in a regulatory vacuum by accident, it happened because almost no regulatory vacuum existed to fill. In 1919, Boston had no requirement that a structure like an industrial storage tank be designed by a licensed engineer or reviewed by an independent inspector before it went into use. A company could build essentially whatever it wanted on its own property, as long as no one stopped it, and no one did. The tank's steel plates and rivets were approved by nobody outside the company that built them, which meant the only people positioned to catch its flaws were the very people with the least incentive to look for them. Chapter 3. The day the tank burst. The days before January 15, 1919 had been bitterly cold, with temperatures well below freezing across Boston. Then, on the 14th, a fresh shipment of molasses arrived from the Caribbean by ship, warmer than the molasses already sitting in the tank, and was pumped in on top of it without much thought given to the difference. Overnight, the temperature swung dramatically upward, climbing from around 2 degrees Fahrenheit just days earlier to above 40 by midday on the 15th. Inside the tank, the mismatched layers of cold and warm molasses were doing something nobody was watching for, fermenting, and building pressure that neither the steel nor anyone in charge of it was prepared to contain. Just after noon, workers and passers-by near the waterfront heard a sound like machine gun fire rattling up and down Commercial Street, thousands of rivets shearing off the tank's steel plates in rapid succession. A deep, groaning rumble followed, and then the tank's walls gave way entirely. In an instant, 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing roughly 26 million pounds, blew outward into the street. Witnesses described the ground itself seeming to shudder, as if the whole neighborhood had been struck by an earthquake rather than a burst container of syrup. Before we move on to the next chapter, if you're enjoying this, please like the video, follow so you don't miss future videos, and turn on notifications. Chapter 4. 35 miles an hour. The collapsing tank sent a wall of molasses roughly 25 feet high tearing through the north end at an estimated 35 miles an hour, faster than most drivers travel on a city street today. The wave was strong enough to buckle steel girders supporting the elevated railway overhead, momentarily lifting a passing streetcar off its tracks. It knocked buildings clean off their foundations, crushed the local firehouse against the ground, and tore through the Boston and Worcester freight terminal, trapping workers inside as the syrup poured through the doors and windows almost too fast to run from. 21 people died and roughly 150 more were injured, along with horses and dogs caught in the surge. Most of the dead were laborers, teamsters, and dock workers whose jobs kept them near the waterfront at midday, though the disaster did not spare children. Among the survivors was a 10-year-old boy named Anthony DiStasio, walking home from school with his sisters when the wave hit. Witnesses said it picked him up and carried him tumbling on its crest, almost as though he were surfing, before dropping him onto the ground so thickly coated in molasses that he could barely breathe or call out for help. Among the dead were several firefighters from the neighborhood's own Engine 31, whose firehouse stood almost directly across the street from the tank. The wave hit the building with enough force to lift it off its foundation and crush its lower floor, trapping the men inside as the syrup poured in through broken windows and doorways. It was a bitter irony that would not have been lost on the survivors. The very crew stationed to protect the North End from disaster was among the first swallowed by one, unable to do anything but fight to save themselves. Chapter 5. A city coated in molasses. The first rescuers on the scene were roughly 100 cadets from the training ship USS Nantucket, docked nearby, who waded directly into the molasses to pull out survivors. Police, Army soldiers, and Red Cross volunteers soon followed, but the syrup itself fought them at every step, thick enough, once it cooled, to trap adults waist-deep and hide them among the wreckage. Doctors set up a makeshift hospital nearby to treat the injured on the spot. The search for the dead stretched on for days, and a few victims weren't recovered from the wreckage and harbor water until months after the disaster. Cleaning the neighborhood took weeks and hundreds of workers, who eventually discovered that salt water from the harbor, pumped through fireboat hoses, cut through the hardened molasses far better than fresh water alone. Even so, the mess outlived the cleanup crews. Boston Harbor itself ran brown with molasses until the middle of summer, and residents tracked the syrup for months on shoe soles, streetcar seats, subway platforms, and telephone handsets across the wider city, turning an already strange disaster into a sticky, months-long inconvenience that touched Bostonians who had never gone near the North End. By nightfall on the day of the flood, the cold January air had already begun turning the spilled molasses into something closer to tar than syrup, and it stayed that way through the following weeks of searching. Rescuers described feeling for bodies with their hands, unable to trust their eyes in the dark, viscous mess, and having to work in short shifts because the fumes and exhaustion became unbearable. Even the harbor water itself turned a murky brown for months, a constant, visible reminder of the neighborhood's worst afternoon every time a boat crossed it. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Within months, roughly 119 residents and businesses sued the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, combining their claims into one of the first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history. The company's defense was dramatic. It insisted the tank had been sabotaged by anarchists opposed to its production of industrial alcohol for munitions. It was a convenient story. Prohibition's 18th Amendment was ratified the very next day, January 16, 1919, and some historians believe the company had been rushing shipments through the tank to squeeze out profit before liquor production became illegal a year later. A court-appointed auditor spent 3 years combing through engineering reports, weather records, and witness testimony before reaching a verdict. In 1925, the auditor ruled against the company. The tank had failed because of poor design and construction, not sabotage. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was ordered to pay roughly $628,000 in damages, worth more than $11 million today, including about $7,000 to each victim's grieving family. The case did more than compensate the injured. It became a milestone in American engineering law, helping establish new requirements that construction plans be signed off by licensed architects and engineers, and inspected before they were ever put to use, rules that, in various forms, still govern how buildings and tanks are approved today. Long after the courtroom closed, the tank kept being re-examined. In the early 2000s, structural engineer Ronald Mayville pulled the auditor's century-old findings apart piece by piece using modern materials science, testing surviving fragments of the original steel. His conclusion only confirmed what the 1925 ruling had already suspected: the steel was roughly half the thickness a tank of that size needed, and it lacked enough manganese to resist the kind of stress cracking that likely started the failure. Nearly 100 years on, metallurgy was still finding new ways to prove that Boston's molasses tank should never have been built the way it was. Chapter 7. The Physics of a Killer. For decades, one detail about the flood puzzled scientists more than any other: how a kitchen staple like molasses could move fast enough to outrun people on foot, and then turn deadly enough to trap and suffocate them. The answer came in 2016, when Harvard researchers Nicole Sharp, Jordan Kennedy, and Shmuel Rubinstein built a scale model of the North End and ran refrigerated corn syrup through it to recreate the conditions of that January afternoon. What they confirmed is that molasses behaves as what's called a non-Newtonian fluid. Under the sudden stress of a tank collapse, it thins out and flows almost like water, which is exactly why the wave could travel as fast as it did. But that same fluid does the opposite once the stress lets up. As the molasses spread across the freezing streets, the cold air pulled the heat out of it, and its viscosity climbed sharply, turning a fast-moving wave into a slow, cement-like mass within minutes. That shift from liquid to nearly solid is what made the flood so lethal. It moved fast enough to catch people by surprise, then thickened just fast enough to pin them in place before rescuers could reach them. Researchers now believe that had the disaster happened in the heat of summer instead of the dead of a Boston winter, the molasses would have stayed thin longer, and far fewer people might have died. The site itself outlasted the tank by decades in a stranger way than anyone expected. North End residents swore that on hot summer days for years afterward, a faint sweetness still hung in the air near Commercial Street, as if the ground itself remembered what had happened. The tank was never rebuilt. The land eventually became a rail yard, and today it's Langone Park, a quiet recreational park with baseball diamonds where children play a short walk from the harbor. A small plaque near the site is the only marker of the disaster that once defined that stretch of waterfront. The Great Molasses Flood sounds like a punchline, and for a century, that's mostly how it's been remembered: a strange footnote, a sticky joke about a sweet food gone rogue. But strip away the absurdity and it's a familiar shape. A company cut corners on safety, ignored the people who noticed, and gambled nothing would go wrong before regulation caught up. It usually takes a disaster, not foresight, to write the rules that keep buildings standing, and the codes that govern how tanks and skyscrapers get built today trace back to 21 people killed by something as ordinary as sugar. That's the story of the Great Molasses Flood of Boston, a tank that groaned for years before anyone listened, a wave that moved faster than the law could catch it, and 21 lives lost to what should have been the most harmless substance in the whole North End. A century later, the streets have long since dried, but the rules it left behind are still holding buildings up. History always has one more secret. Follow the oddities of history, and witness the past up close.